Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabert. We are Magi. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry.
A European Entrancement, Animal Magnetism among the Russian Nobility in France and St. Petersburg, 1784 to 87, by Robert Collis, Associate Professor of History at Drake University, Des Moines, Iowa, United States. On 18th of August 1784, Ivan Sergeyevich Baryatinsky, the Russian ambassador to France, wrote a report to Empress Catherine II on her orders about Franz Anton Mesmer and animal magnetism. The ambassador's dispatch was written a mere 7 days after the presentation of a report to King Louis XVI by a specially appointed royal commission composed of 5 scientists of the French Academy of Sciences: Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, Joseph Ignace Guillotin, Jean Dachet, and Michel Joseph Magot. These 5 eminent figures signed their names to a report that largely dismissed the purported curative powers touted by Mesmer. Baryatinsky's own report on Mesmer and his theory of animal magnetism is not revelatory. The ambassador himself passed no real judgment on animal magnetism, but does indicate to the Russian monarch that the public are divided into 2 parts. One believes and the other does not. Moreover, he added that several court ladies were among Mesmer's patients. The Russian ambassador's explicit reference to court ladies may well have been influenced by the widespread concerns among many in Parisian educated and noble circles about the potential for sexual abuse by male magnetizers on supposedly vulnerable female patients. Indeed, the royal commissioners themselves communicated to Louis XVI about how easy it would be to abuse a woman in such a state. Baryatinsky also supplied the Russian empress with a basic description of Mesmer's techniques, which he had been promoting in Paris since 1778, as well as highlighting that Mesmer himself had refused to demonstrate his technique before the royal commission. In his stead, as the ambassador noted, Charles Delon sought to prove the efficacy of the medical treatment. Initially, Mesmer treated patients individually, with the goal of restoring the equilibrium within the human organism of a universal fluid. In other words, ailments within the human body stemmed from obstructions to this invisible fluid. Mesmer's goal was to restore a natural balance to his patient by banishing these obstacles via direct and often prolonged massaging of bodily poles. This physical procedure was intended to induce a crisis. Convulsions were common that preceded the re-establishment of harmony within a patient. By 1784, the popularity of Mesmer's method of magnetic healing in Paris led Mesmer to adapt his technique in order to accommodate the increased demand on his services. Instead of one-on-one treatment, he devised a method of simultaneously treating groups around a wooden tub or baquette. The tub contained iron filings and was filled with magnetized water. Patients gathered around the baquette in a circle, holding hands whilst also touching protruding iron rods in order to be healed. The publication of the Royal Commission's reports on animal magnetism dealt Mesmer and Delon a blow from which they never truly recovered. The flood of satirical prints that were published in France in the wake of the report, alongside plays such as Le Docteur Moderne by Pierre-Yves Barré and Jean-Baptiste Radet, is testament to the hostility felt among sections of French Ancien Régime society towards Mesmer and his theory. It was variously ridiculed as being a superstitious, occult-ridden remnant of an unenlightened age that promoted devilish manipulation, sexual depravity, and was a threat to social cohesion and the status quo. The Russian Empress was surely encouraged when reading the reports of the French Royal Commission and her own ambassador in August 1784. As Rudolf Bourdin has recently noted, Catherine II at this time was already scathing of what she saw as the excitable tendency of the denizens of Paris to need a new marotte, that is, a new folly or fad, every month to take the place of its puppets. She made these remarks on 8th of May 1784 in a letter to Frederick Melchior Grimm, after receiving regular reports on the exploits of the Montgolfier brothers and their hot air balloon from Bariatinski since November 1783. By the time that the Empress had penned her letter to Grimm, she had already taken decisive action in her realm by banning so-called aerostations on April 4, 1784, shortly after a Frenchman named Mesnil made 2 attempts in a hot air balloon in Moscow in February and March. Significantly, in this same letter, she also tellingly compared the foolishness and fraudulence of balloon adventurers to the work of the charlatan who cures vapours, or in other words, nervous disorders, including hysteria. Here, Catherine II was taking direct aim at the followers of Mesmer, who were particularly associated with treating this common ailment among the noble women of Paris. The swift action of the Russian Empress in April 1784 against aerostation adventurers in her realm, ostensibly on the grounds of the risk of fire posed by their gaseous inventions, was not necessary against so-called vapour charlatans, as none had yet sought to promote their purported medicinal art. Indeed, in a letter written to Grimm in March 1785, Catherine II conveys a dismissive yet relaxed attitude to the controversial medical theory. I have always said that this magnetism, which does not cure anyone, cannot kill anyone either. Thus, in the spring of 1785, the Russian monarch did not convey any sense that animal magnetism posed a threat within her large empire to either the medical establishment or the moral order of her nobility. The timely surveillance reports on hot air balloons and animal magnetism supplied by Bariatinski from Paris in 1783 and 1784 allowed the Russian Empress to not only monitor the negative effects of such fads in the French capital, but also to remain vigilant against any such follies attracting any modicum of éclat in her own realm. By this time, few among the Russian nobility would have remained oblivious to the renown of Mesmer's controversial technique. Readers of the St. Petersburg Vedomosti, for example, first began to be informed about the seemingly miraculous cures achieved by Mesmer on the 31st of March 1777, when the Swabian physician was still plying his trade in Vienna. On this day, the capital city's principal newspaper featured a lengthy report about how Mesmer had purportedly cured the blindness of Maria Teresa von Paradis, a well-known 18-year-old pianist. Irregular reports about the cures rendered on patients by Mesmer continued to feature in both the St. Petersburg Vedomosti and the Moskovsky Vedomosti into the early 1780s. Mesmer's possessive control over his secretive technique ensured that for many years he maintained a virtual monopoly on the promotion of and treatment by animal magnetism. Consequently, until 1784, Europe as a whole remained devoid of practitioners of animal magnetism, apart from a relatively small number of Mesmer's devotees in Paris. Thus, although many European wondermongers came to promote their miraculous cures in the Russian Empire in the early 1780s, none advertised themselves as animal magnetists. Most notably, for example, the Italian Giuseppe Maggi successfully promoted his use of electrical medicine as a wondrous cure of a host of ailments among the Russian nobility between 1773 and 1787. Nonetheless, at no point during his relatively long career, based in Moscow, did Maggi advertise any form of animal magnetism. Hence, with her gaze focused on the French capital and the negative ramifications heaped on Mesmer and his Parisian followers, Catherine II was not overly preoccupied with the possibility that the nobility within her realm would be swayed by what seemed to be a pseudo-medical theory widely mocked and held in disrepute. Yet unbeknownst to either Bariatinski or herself, a different form of animal magnetism, which came to be known as magnetic or artificial somnambulism, was being developed by Freemasons of a distinctly Illuminist hue in Lyon in the summer of 1784. Christine Berger has defined Illuminism at this time as a complex intellectual and spiritual movement, the practitioners of which were adventurers of thought. I would add that these adventurers of thought often delved into occult philosophy, as it was known in the early modern period, or Western esotericism, as has become commonplace in academia since the 1970s. It was during the summer of 1784 that Alexander Pierre Louis de Barbarin de Boost delivered a form of magnetic somnambulism in Lyon. Differed considerably from the form of animal magnetism promoted by Franz-Antoine Mesmer in Paris since 1778. Unlike the Mesmerist version of animal magnetism, Barbarin's magnetic somnambulism involved no physical contact with patients and entirely jettisoned the utilization of a baguette. Indeed, Barbarin argued that it was possible to magnetize and cure a patient from afar. His innovative theory was embraced by both the local Illuminist lodge of La Respectable Loge de la Bienfaisance and the affiliated Société de la Concorde, which were both led by Jean-Baptiste Villemotz. Furthermore, in the second half of 1784, Barbarin and the Mason magnetizers of Lyon, led by Villemotz, came to believe that those in a state of magnetic somnambulism, particularly women, were able to prophesize and communicate with angelic entities. This Barbarinian strand of magnetic somnambulism was redolent of Emanuel Swedenborg's espousal of spirit communication that purported to offer prophetic potentiality. Indeed, it can be viewed as a distinctive branch of a broader fascination among Swedenborgians and other like-minded Illuminists in the late 18th century, in direct correspondence with paranormal entities that offered up, in their view, new revelatory insights into the divine secrets of God's universe. Thus, Barbarin's strand of magnetic somnambulism shared the original form of animal magnetism advocated by Mesmer vis-à-vis the ability to heal patients, although the methods were entirely different. However, in a radical departure from the materialist techniques avowed by the Swabian physician, Barbarin embraced the spiritual potential of magnetic somnambulism to facilitate divine communication and insights from somnambules. The principles of magnetic somnambulism developed by Barbarin at this time followed rapidly on the heels of the groundbreaking use of somnambulism in May 1784 by Armand Marie-Jacques de Chastenay, Marquis de Puisségur, on his country estate near Soissons in northern France. Puisségur's form of magnetic somnambulism never ventured into the realms of spirit communication. Instead, he developed the notion of the power of suggestion and the ability of a patient to gain a heightened state of inner awareness or consciousness in a somnambulistic state. This method of magnetic somnambulism was soon enthusiastically embraced by his fellow Freemasons in Strasbourg and has been recognized by historians of behavioral science as a crucial moment in the history of modern psychology. Hence, by the summer of 1784, two distinct forms of magnetic somnambulism had emerged in Lyon and Strasbourg that, whilst owing their existence to Mesmer's doctrine of animal magnetism, had branched off into two completely different spheres, a spiritual realm in Lyon and a form of early suggestive hypnotism in Strasbourg, long before James Braid's adoption of the term hypnotism in 1842, as a harbinger of dynamic psychiatry. Crucially, both these strands of animal magnetism were not reliant on either formal endorsement by the scientific establishment or the income generated by wealthy clients. Instead, they thrived in a Masonic milieu largely devoid of scrutiny. By the summer of 1784, the Mason magnetizers of Lyon saw an opportunity to promote their pioneering form of magnetic somnambulism as an enticing means to attract eminent young noblemen from across Europe, including the Russian Empire, into their fold. With this in mind, this paper will specifically focus on an examination of how three prominent Russian noblemen, Mikhail Andreevich Golitsyn, Alexei Grigorovich Bobrinsky, the illegitimate son of Catherine II, and Vasily Nikolaevich Zinoviev, were all drawn into the milieu of Lyon magnetists through a Masonic network promoted from the city by Jean-Baptiste Villemot that stretched across the European continent. The second part of this article will then focus on the notable importation of both mesmerist and Barberinian forms of animal magnetism into St. Petersburg in 1786, where it was briefly practiced by Carl Friedrich Thiemann and a certain Major Blankennagel. However, the arrival of the much maligned treatment in the Russian capital soon attracted the ire of the Russian Empress, who quickly nullified the perceived threat for the rest of her reign. Very little has been written about the influence of animal magnetism on educated society in the Russian Empire in either its first period of relative popularity, between when it was first championed by Franz Anton Mesmer in Vienna in the mid-1770s and the French Revolution, or when it saw a revival throughout Europe after the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815. The sole English-language account amounts to a short summary written in 1968 by Lyudmila Zielinski, which merely provides a simplistic and condescending overview. According to Zielinski, the history of animal magnetism in the Russian Empire only began in 1815, owing to the fact that specific historical and geographical factors meant that cultural developments in the West took a considerable time to reach the country. Furthermore, she argues that animal magnetism in Russia was largely limited to a scientific approach after 1815, which was propounded by German academics. Limited correctives to this blinkered appraisal have been provided since the late 1980s by the Russian historians Sergei Mikhailovich Krompak, Konstantin Anatolyevich Bogdanov, and Yuri Yevgenyevich Kondakov. All three historians briefly discuss evidence suggesting that animal magnetism was practiced in the Russian Empire, albeit not in a widespread manner, before the French Revolution. Most recently, Victoire Villebois and Laetitia Decaux, in their study of the subject of animal magnetism in Russian romantic short stories of the 1830s and 40s, contextualize their work by providing a succinct overview of the introduction of the pseudo-scientific discipline into Russia in the 1780s and its subsequent resurgence after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. Unlike the paucity of historical analysis vis-à-vis animal magnetism in the Russian Empire before the French Revolution, anyone wishing to know more about the historical significance of animal magnetism in French society during this era can draw on a wealth of excellent material. The reassessment of the importance of animal magnetism within French culture and society stems in large measure from the publication of Robert Darnton's seminal work, Mesmerism and the End of the Enlightenment, in 1968. This debt is acknowledged in a 2018 special edition of Annales historiques de la Révolution française devoted to animal magnetism, in which a variety of specialists assess the profound impact of animal magnetism in France in the decade before the French Revolution. Whilst we are spoilt for choice when seeking to know more about the complex phenomenon of animal magnetism within France in the 1780s, It was still the case until the end of the 20th century, as Patricia Farah noted in 1995, that very few historians have described contemporary practices in other European countries. Since pronouncing this statement, however, numerous scholars have drawn attention to the links between animal magnetism and various aspects of late 18th and early 19th century culture throughout Europe, including the Romantic movement in Germany, medicine in Spain, and the Holy Office in Rome. By 1784, Jean-Baptiste Villemotte succeeded in forging an extensive network of Illuminist Freemasons across Europe who adhered to his highly esoteric form of Freemasonry, officially known as the Rectified Scottish Rite. A more common name for this branch of esoteric and mystical Freemasonry was Martinism, after its founder Martinez de Pasquale and its foremost thinker Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin.